Western sanctions, deep strikes, and the collapse of the Russian budget, the Kremlin's economy is on the brink. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, questioned Russia's military and economic strength, calling it a paper tiger. Why is Moscow forced to raise taxes and restrict fuel sales? You will find out more about this in the following report.
The White House is raising the stakes. The U.S. president made it clear that time is running out for Moscow due to the depletion of its resources. The American administration is ready to immediately impose powerful tariffs if Russia does not stop its aggression against Ukraine.
The greatest progress is that the Russian economy is now in a terrible state. As you know, it is in decline. And frankly, Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army. It's amazing.
Not just with sanctions alone. Experts believe that the Russian economy today is hanging by a thin thread, the strength of which depends entirely on China.
In fact, as of today, Russia is completely dependent on China. As a result, Russians are overpaying for this. The deficit amounted to almost 5 trillion rubles. And this is a serious challenge for the Russian budget. Even if they use all the funds, they have to cover the budget deficit. Even that won't help them fully cover it.
However, the symptoms of the crisis are clearly visible inside the country. The government is discussing raising VAT from 20 to 22%. The official reason given is the budget gap. Meanwhile, the war with Ukraine consumes over 40% of state revenues, and it is impossible to cut spending on the army and special services. So taxes are rising as well.
It's important to understand, it's often said that this is a tax paid by the end consumer. If you want to invest in something, to buy, for example, raw materials, now you'll have to pay 1.7% more. Considering that today businesses are facing serious problems, namely that they lack funds for investment, as a result, since their working capital is decreasing, they will either raise prices and raise them by more than the 2% by which VAT is increasing, or this will lead to an even faster acceleration of the decline of the Russian economy.
The situation is also being aggravated by Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries. In just 1 week, SBU drones struck plants in Bashkortostan twice. Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat, one of the largest oil refineries in Russia, suffered serious damage. They produce about 150 types of products there, from diesel fuel to polyethylene, and the distance from Ukrainian territory to the target is about 1,400 kilometers.
According to preliminary information, the LAVT-6 primary oil processing unit was hit. This facility processed up to 10 million tons of oil per year and is a key producer of liquid rocket fuel in Russia.
Our Ukrainian armed forces have chosen the best time to strike oil refineries. The strikes have become more precise and more effective at destroying key installations. In fact, there isn't a single plant that has been hit 2 or 3 times. So the timing was chosen absolutely perfectly. And precisely because this timing was chosen and the effectiveness of the strikes is quite high, it has led to the fact that as of today, there simply isn't enough gasoline at gas stations in the country to ensure the functioning of its economy.
Due to the attacks and rising prices across the border, a gasoline shortage has emerged. Sales limits are already in effect in the Moscow, Leningrad, Ryazan, and several other regions. And Russian social media channels are already panicking because drivers are only being allowed to buy 10 to 20 liters of gasoline, and sometimes only diesel fuel is available.
The manager decided to temporarily close the gas station because there was no gasoline. The gas station in the neighboring village also closed, and at others they simply ran out of gasoline.
People simply have no way to refuel. Most gas stations have set limits. The rising price of gasoline means their wallets are getting thinner much faster than before. But the real problem is there is no gasoline.
Nevertheless, Russian oil continues to be purchased not only in China and India, but also in the EU. Despite all the sanctions and statements, last year EU countries spent over 21 billion euros on its purchase. That's even more than the amount of financial aid provided to Ukraine. Sofia Zelinska, Halina Pirohova, details for Intermarathon TV channel United News.
A GUR unit destroyed 2 enemy AN-26 aircraft and 2 coastal radar stations in temporarily occupied Crimea. The military special unit primary carried out strikes on Russian targets. The GUR added that the enemy's losses were recorded in the General Staff's report for September 24th of this year. We will ask the spokesperson of the Naval Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Dmytro Pletenchuk, for more details about the consequences of the strikes on Crimea and Russian ports. He is joining us live right now. Mr. Dmytro, greetings. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Greetings, Mr. Alexander. Greetings to the studio and the viewers.
Mr. Dimitro, I want to start with this GUR operation that I mentioned before our conversation about the destruction of 2 aircraft and a radar station. We understand that this is a GUR operation, but we often know that the Navy is also involved in such operations. Was that the case this time? Were the Navy involved? And perhaps you have some information about the consequences that can, of course, be shared on air?
Of course, we cannot disclose the specifics of how such operations are carried out or organized. I can only note that, once again, the Russian forces were compelled to lose precisely those critical units that they primarily and consistently utilize for their counter-drone operations. And this particular track is both incredibly telling and profoundly important, because all of the various units you clearly saw in the recent footage are predominantly used for this specific purpose, just like the impressive BE-200, sorry, I meant the BE-12, and also the larger BE-200 as well, which they occasionally use from time to time. That's another distinct model of the very same type of specialized anti-submarine aircraft, and various helicopters are also utilized. That's precisely why this recent strike is quite precisely targeted and highly effective.
Also, the day before, we saw strikes on the ports of Novorossiysk and Tuapse, basically 2 ports in one day. What can you tell us about the consequences of these strikes for the Russians?
Well, mostly, of course, the consequences could be economic. Considering that, in such situations, transshipment usually comes to a halt. However, to say that the consequences will be critical, at this point, I'm not ready to say that. There is no confirmed information about that. Of course, in any given situation, when you unexpectedly see an unidentified drone within your harbor area, that certainly says a great deal. But, for example, precisely how it ultimately ended up there, at this moment, I also cannot provide any truly verified information.
Understood. Then let's talk about verified information, specifically about the current operational situation in the Black and Azov Seas. Tell us, what is the situation there now? Are there any enemy cruise missile carriers on combat duty there?
Yes, that's absolutely correct in this regard. We can provide such information. As of today, no ships have been observed there, including cruise missile carriers. They are stationed at their bases. Unfortunately, Russian aviation remains active, and that's a fact, in particular from the Black Sea Fleet. However, for the protection of their bases, they only send out small boats of various makes and names, but all of roughly the same class, on external patrols. These are boats they use for anti-sabotage operations, coastal inspections, and searching for mine-like objects. So it can be said that the situation here has remained virtually unchanged for quite some time.
Thank you for the prompt information. Thank you for answering our questions. We were joined live by the spokesperson of the Naval Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Dmytro Pletenchuk.
As of today, there is no gasoline in Crimea. Fuel has disappeared from almost all gas stations. Local drivers and visitors to the Ukrainian Republic annexed by Russia have been lining up in long queues at gas stations since morning, hoping that gasoline will eventually be delivered somewhere. However, photos from Crimea show that only diesel fuel and gas are available there. There is already information emerging that in Telegram Crimeans are creating channels where they share information about where fuel is available. But even there, it disappears very quickly, because those who manage to get to the pumps with 92, 95, or even the most expensive 100-octane gasoline, fill not only their tanks but also buy several extra canisters. And because of this kind of feverish buying, the fuel runs out within an hour or two. There is also information that, due to collusion, some empty gas stations simply close down to avoid paying salaries to their employees. The fuel shortage in Russia is being observed in at least 12.5 regions. It has lasted for more than 3 weeks, but it was the occupied Crimea that became the first place where gasoline completely disappeared. The cause of the crisis in Russia itself is said to be the attacks by Ukrainian drones, which have been successfully striking the enemy's oil refineries on its own territory.